When I was just a child, some Spanish missionary nuns of the Daughters of Charity arrived in my village, and they had a real impact on me. Above all, I was struck by their capacity to welcome all kinds of people without distinction, their extraordinary charity, their commitment to life. I saw and this as I grew up because although I had very little contact with them, I liked their attitude of mercy, welcome, love, unconditional dedication. Because I saw the same thing in the attitudes of the grandmothers of my people, whom today we call our ancestors. Discrimination and racism were not part of their code. In my youth, I had an experience during my teaching practice as I was accompanying peasants in the mountains in the western part of my country. I saw a lot of abuse of labor and psychological power towards peasants and indigenous women by their bosses. And I was so shocked that I said, after graduating as a teacher, I will become a policewoman to defend them, to advocate for them. I could smell a stench of discrimination and racism from them towards the poor people of the village, although by then no one had ever treated me with a racist attitude. And then as I discovered God's dream for me, I realized that it was not with force and violence that you win the hearts of the abusers, because they are other vulnerable brothers and sisters in need of saving love. And it was then that the phrase of Saint Romero, which I found in a prayer card of Saint Vincent de Paul, struck me. And this phrase says, "Would you like to be the voice of the voiceless?" Motivated, and that sentence motivated my youthful life, along with the invitation of Saint John Paul II in 1982 on the civilization of love. And these motivations helped me understand that charity means love of neighbor without distinction. Therefore, I asked the Daughters of Charity of my village to support me to be like them and advocate for human dignity. On January the 14th, 1986, I was 22 years old, and after an experience as a teacher in a mountain area in my country, Honduras, I resigned from my teaching post and decided to give myself completely to the Lord in the person of Jesus Christ, to serve the poor, the most excluded, the invisible, the marginalized, and rejected by society. And to this day, I am infinitely grateful to the God of Jesus and of my ancestors for having given me this vocation. Now, as to my first steps in religious life, they were taken in the shadow of racism. And to express what I think, I would like to use the words of Amador Figue when back in 2017 said, "The Catholic Church has always defended legalism, uniformity, and verticality in its power relations. And all these assumptions, being strongly rooted in its essence as a church, hinder its progress towards a dialogue with openness and respect for the different faiths, cultures, and ethnicities present in the world, despite the directives of Vatican II in this regard." And if I am to speak about religious life and racism from my own experience, I must begin by pointing out that it is in religious life that I have had the best experiences of my life, but also the most ignominious ones. For example, during my experience in the first community where I was sent as a postulant, the one who accompanied my process had a very racist attitude towards me and her discriminatory behavior. So she forced me to eat all kinds of food that I didn't like and told me that if I did not do so, it was a sign that I had no vocation for religious life, conditioning the theological value of my own vocation. And the sister would no longer speak to me, no matter how much I spoke to her, and she would ignore me even in front of the community. And with this tremendous rejection, she disliked everything I did or said. And she always repeated, "Black people are no good." And as for prayer and personal encounter with God, she demanded that I kneeled all the time in prayer as she did in a small chapel facing only one place. And I watched them all fall asleep, and that made me afraid and sleepy. And that atmosphere of prayer didn't say anything to me at all, and I didn't consider it as prayer. And when I acted like that, I was told that I didn't know how to pray, so I didn't have a vocation. I shared with them, that my prayer was contemplating nature in the sea, the mountain, the river, the rain, the moon, the sun. I was talking to God at all times through these elements of nature and accompanying the birds in their praise to God, singing and dancing to the rhythm of the drum. And this sharing of mine was a source of ridicule and laughter from the others. And then in October 1986, a very humane superior, aware of my being culturally different, gave me the opportunity to live in another community of 8 sisters. And I was there for more than a year, and the superior valued me. The boarding girls accepted me, my high school and handicraft students loved me too. I taught them singing when we played, we had fun together. And as Psalm 133 says, see how good and how delightful it is for brothers to dwell together in harmony. And Anna, a 9-year-old girl, painted herself black because she wanted to be black like me. And most of the sisters respected me. Others, however, openly discriminated against me because of my color, because of the color of my skin, and made jokes among themselves about the black bean, using phrases such as, do you like black people? And the other one would look at me and say, I don't like African women, with sarcastic and mocking laughter. And to get out of the blasphemous logic of racism, we must begin by purifying our gaze, since nurturing racist thoughts and attitudes is a sin that goes against the message of Christ. And on my birthday that year, in 1987, one of the sisters gave me a frog wrapped in wrapping paper, and I cried a lot. I felt really, really bad, while they laughed at and made fun of me. And there were no conditions even for me to complain, because the consequences were even worse. And today I call this attitude blasphemy, psychological abuse. I call it sin. We cannot invoke God, the Father of all, if we refuse to conduct ourselves fraternally as brothers and sisters, created in the image of God. As the scripture says, he who does not love has not known God. We read it in John 1:4-8. During my novitiate in the shadow of racism, in the novitiate I continued to experience racism manifested in exhibitions, kneeling, humiliations, repressions. I was excluded from the participation in the liturgy, reading, and other delicate offices. And I was made to clean every day a corridor where there were only a few large crates and a very sad, dry, dirty, lifeless garden that no longer produced roses. And every day I would talk to the sad roses, poured water on them, cleaned them, took care of them, and expressed my complaints and sufferings and anguish to them. And after a few months, the roses multiplied. Then it was from there that the novice mistress cut them for her office and for Our Lady. And everything changed, but I never stopped talking to the roses. In January 1989, I was sent to the Apostolic Experiences, where I was very enthusiastic. I went down with my suitcase, and as soon as the sister in charge of the community where I was assigned saw me, she made an unpleasant gesture as if she was going to puke up. And she said, "Is that the black one they give me?" And I looked at her and ducked. And from that moment on, she rejected me, and her attitude made me distrustful. And that was open discrimination, total racism, that made me not want to go with her, but I had no other option but to keep quiet and put up with it all. And I went with her, and all the way there she didn't say a word to me. And in the religious community, she spoke very badly of black people. She looked for ways to humiliate me. hiding the chocolates because, according to her, the black woman could finish them as she has the color of chocolate. And as we read in the Song of Songs, I am dark but fair, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not notice that I am brown, for the sun has scorched me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, and I did not keep my own vineyard. 8 days after that unpleasant experience, I fell ill. I was hospitalized, and the sister of the first discriminatory experience was there. I heard the comment she made to another sister: "The black woman has perforated intestines, and she will not serve as a servant of the poor." Thank God it was not like that. After a month, God healed me, and I was sent to a mission in another country. And there I was also humiliated by the person in charge of the community because of the color of my skin. And she didn't want me to participate in the Afro masses. She said to me, "Why don't you go back to Africa?" And the church seeks, above all, to change the racist mentality, even within its communities, and yet it recognizes the limits and sins of its subjects. Christians will have to admit with humility that they have not always been consistent in the field of racism in the course of history. Illuminated by this sentence, I refer to the following racist and colonialist attitudes, and this is the testimony I witnessed. The attitude of the priest who criticized the red collar worn by the Afro and indigenous children on their wrists. The one who interrupted the celebration of the Eucharist because the Lord's Prayer was sung in an Afro language, in a community where 99.5% of the parishioners were native speakers of that language. And the priest who controls the personal growth workshops in Afro to prevent any element of the ancestral culture from being introduced into the content of the workshop. Or the priest with a colonialist attitude who accuses the Afro-ethnic nun of being a worshipper of the sea for the simple fact of dancing in front of the sea with the workshop participants of her ethnic group. So these are the attitudes of institutionalized racism, the aftermath of colonialism, which seeks to perpetuate itself in not only governmental but also ecclesiastical institutions, in many members with a fundamentalist mentality that tramples on the dignity of those who are different from them in their phenotypical characteristics, culture, social, economic, religious, and ideological circles. And all these attitudes lead to the death of siblings. They are an expression of the Cainist attitude that destroys their siblings for not being like them. Racial prejudice, which denies equal dignity to all members of the human race and blasphemes against the Creator, must be fought at its roots, as St. John Paul II said. I must be honest in saying that I have seen and heard many priests, religious, and missionaries defend life in the face of racism and discrimination in all its dimensions, but I have also seen many trample on the process of liberation, healing, and vindication of the rights of Afro people and native peoples. For example, what a former Afro seminarian tells us: whoever was my formator at the time predicted that I would not become a priest because black people, according to him, are promiscuous and do not have the tenacity required for religious life. And in my pastoral year in the mission, I was isolated. I did not live in the same house as everyone else, but rather I lived alone in a small, secluded house next to the parish church, together with the watchman and the dogs. And my white companions who were going through the same process as me lived in the curule house and were in community with the priests. I always tried to assume the whole process with humility and meekness until it became an affront to human dignity. And so the omen of the aforementioned priest was fulfilled, and I withdrew. And another testimony of a religious sister. In one of the schools where I was appointed on the day of prayer, in front of all the students and staff, the headmistress of the school said into a microphone, "I don't want Africans in my school." Everyone looked at me and I felt really bad. But despite the inhuman treatment, where I repeatedly went without food, I stayed there for 6 years. And then another testimony of another religious sister. The superior of the community told me, "You wear loincloths. You know what it is like to dress like a person. You live in the mountains." And when I took this to the superiors, I was not listened to. They just blamed me and approved what the other one said. Another testimony of an Afro-religious sister. When my brother died in an accident, the person in charge of the community refused me permission to travel because it was not a family visit date. And he would say, "These blacks even want to go home for the death of a dog. And if I complain, I am labeled as a troublemaker." Another testimony of a former Afro-religious. The person in charge of formation of the province and my personal spiritual guide, in a moment of reflection several years later, told me that he had not authorized me to go and do a year of theological studies in Afro theology in Brazil purely because of racial prejudice against me. I say that today racism manifests itself in different forms of discrimination, exclusion, and invisibilization in society, in our church, and in some religious congregations, sometimes in disguise and sometimes overtly. And it is still alive, not only with respect to Afro descendants, but also with respect to the original peoples, the native peoples of various Latin American countries. And an example of institutionalized racism is that in Brazil, where more than half of the population is of African descent, of the 400 bishops in our Catholic Church, only 40 black bishops are registered. How can this be explained if not by the colonialist and racist label? There is a testimony of a young former seminarian which says, "I lived experiences such as having to hear offensive jokes about the physical characteristics of black people, or equating white children with angels and black children with bats. All this by priests, justifying their actions as jokes and blather. Therefore, I say that the racist attitude of discriminating against brothers and sisters because of the color of their skin, because of any phenotypical characteristic, culture, academic formation, belief, lifestyle, and considering them inferior to others, marginalizing them, leaving them without opportunity, with unequal treatment, devaluation, stigmatization, stereotyping them, all these attitudes are attempts against life. Therefore, sin that leads to death. If this happens in our church, congregations, institutions, organizations, communities, parishes, dioceses, and pastoral groups, we are destroying life and God's dream for humanity. The colonialist system bequeathed to our church racism with the atrocities of the past towards those they called Indians and blacks. There is evidence that many members of the church continue to maintain racism with attitudes of condemnation, rejection, devaluation, contempt, a sense of superiority, mockery, disrespect, unequal treatment, exclusion, and invisibility of their spirituality, religiosity, worldview, culture, genuine traditions of the original peoples of Afro and Afro descendants, and they also treat women with attitudes that are inconsistent with what they preach. As Isaiah says in 29:13, the Lord says, "For this people draw near to me with their mouth, and with their lips they honor me, but their heart is far from me, and their fear of me is but a commandment of men which they have been taught." In what does this racism manifest itself in the church? In discrimination, abuse of power, devaluation, denial, gestures of double meaning, false accusations for incorporating elements of my culture in pastoral activity, isolation, mockery, rude jokes, labels, rejections, contempt, false reports to superiors, indifference, exclusion, threats of a negative evaluation, deprivation of basic needs such as medicines, food, and others. Then marginalization, reports inconsistent with reality, psychological abuse, frequent change of place of apostolate, among others. In offensive jokes about the phenotypical aspects of Afro-descendants, making stereotypical judgments about Afro-descendants. In this respect, devaluation and lack of commitment and dynamic involvement of church and religious leaders with Afro-descendants and native peoples, or prohibiting the process of accompanying Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples from their own roots. Religious communities do not assume an inculturated strategy of the gospel for Afro and native people candidates. Unfounded accusations, blaming, not taking into account our voice in community decisions, not recognizing our capacities, our abilities, denying authorization for opportunities for improvement and specialized training with an Afro approach, doubting our intellectual capacities. And then inhuman attitudes, public humiliation, discrediting, preventing, and encouraging others to despise Afro-descendants. I don't want Africans in my school, we also heard that. And then making us invisible and using hurtful and discriminatory expressions, ignoring, plotting, for example, to boycott the allocation of positions of power for Afros and indigenous people. What racism generates in the lives of those affected? Well, all these ignominious racist actions generate a serious impact on the mental, emotional, and physical health of the person, such as depression, impotence, feelings of rejection, low self-esteem, emotional instability, and other psychological problems, vocational frustration, distraction, and spiritual crime. Now, the plan of action I'd like to propose, due to the magnitude and seriousness of the situation of racism within the Church towards Afro and Native peoples, which is evident in the testimonies of religious and other members of the Church, we ask the Holy Father Pope Francis through Selam the creation of an Afro-Ecclesial Conference for Latin America and the Caribbean, at the same level as the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon. And finally, I would like to express my deep gratitude as a Church and as a member of a religious congregation for this openness and listening. However, I must also note that the colonial and racist relationship still persists in the Church as an institution with respect to the Afro-American and Native peoples, and this relationship is manifested within the religious communities towards the candidates, novices, and other members of these communities who come from these ethnic groups. So we must change this attitude contrary to the gospel of Jesus at root. Now, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Voices of Faith for extending our voice to all the courageous women and men who shared with me their experiences of racism in the Church and in religious life, to the Afro Garifuna Inculturated Pastoral Theology Work and Reflection Team for Central and North America, the Pagaisena, to the Secretariat of the Afro-Latin American and Caribbean Pastoral Work, the CEPAC, to my Vincentian congregation for allowing me to stand up for the respect of human dignity, to advocate for human dignity. Also to the Episcopal Conference of Latin America and the Caribbean, CELAM, and the Conference of Religious of Latin America and the Caribbean, the CLAR, for their continuous support and backing in this process of listening and in this synodal journey to which our Universal Catholic Church has invited us. Thank you.